Hi, I'm Sharon Patterson.
And I'm Keith Murphy. Welcome to Black Nouveau.
Now, on tonight's show, it's all about history makers here in the city of Milwaukee. We're going to honor two great movers and shakers who may be gone, Keith, but who are certainly never will be forgotten.
And tonight we remember and honor Reverend W.J.G. Mclin and journalist Mattie Bell Woods, two of our pioneers who did much to shape the city we live in today.
And we'll start with Reverend W.J.G. Mclin, one of Milwaukee's religious leaders during the 40s and 50s, who was a catalyst for change in housing, employment, and integration. If you don't know his story, it's time you did, as his family gives us a brief look into this remarkable man's life.
Looking for an idea for a documentary to produce, Lazine DuPree started researching his family history and their ties to the South. On speaking with his mother, though, she said the South was interesting, but why not do one on your grandfather? And he said he was.
And I said, well, I am on the DuPree side. She said, no, you need to do one on the Mclin side. And I'm glad she said that, because I didn't know what a fascinating and storied life that my grandfather had led.
His grandfather was the Honorable Reverend W.J.G. William Joseph Green Mclin of the St. Matthew's CME Christian Methodist Episcopal Church at a time when the C in CME stood for colored.
He fought. Very, very intelligent man. He had 3 different college degrees. He had his doctorate. And he was a man who fought for everyone worshiping in the church. That was his main focus in life. He focused a lot on education. He had a lot of political point of views. But he was most famous for having blacks, whites, everyone at that time worship together. You know, he used sports a lot as an analogy. He always said back in the 50s that blacks and whites are together in sports. Why not, if we can play together in sports, why not worship together in life? And he really focused on that and stressed on that and you know, to his parishioners and in life in general.
Born 6 years after the death of his grandfather, he didn't get to know him, but through research and family, he started gathering information on a person he wished he had known personally.
I found out that he was the first one on one of the main television stations here in Milwaukee, first black reverend ever to preach. He just had many firsts. He would do things like, back in 1952 or so, he told all his parishioners to go and invite a white parishioner to his church. And it was something back then, politically and just emotionally, and you know, the temperament back then, it was you just didn't do that. And he said, you know, well, we need to worship together. Let's stress this. Let's fight against segregation as much as we possibly can. And he was just very strong on that. And another thing is he stressed education. He always told all his kids, you need to be college educated. You need to have your high school education. You need to, that's so important in life that if you don't have that, you will not go anywhere. So I found out many things about what he did.
What was it like growing up being a child of a minister who was so involved in the community?
It was just like any other child growing up, except for the fact that I didn't like being called a preacher's kid. When I was little, being a PK, a preacher's kid, it was kind of embarrassing, and it was kind of stressful because a lot of the kids would tease us. The adults would put us on pedestals. So if other kids went to neighborhood shows and they saw the preacher's kids at the neighborhood show, they thought we were heading on our way to hell.
It was wonderful, and to the point of being wonderful, it was because you got so much involved, aware of the situations that were around you on an everyday basis, not just in the church, but the people that we knew from his involvement that weren't limited just to our race. That was a big thing, because at the time when we were young, and me being the youngest, I remember so well of the people that used to come through the church. I remember the famous names, like an old Milwaukee Brave named Billy Bruton, a senator like a Proxmire, a Uleheim that donated an organ to our church. You know, things like that that were probably out of the norm for that particular time because of the respect that he had garnered from the community.
I didn't know the wonderful things he was doing until later. In fact, I think when I really discovered, and I don't want to sound like I'm bragging, but how brilliant he was when a friend of mine, this athletic gentleman, who was brilliant himself, went to church with me one Sunday. And when church was over, he said, "My God, your father is brilliant." And I was a teenager by then, and at that time, that's when I started really listening to my father and paying attention to what he was doing.
I remember that he was a staunch disciplinarian, but he was a person that cared deeply about his community. Unfortunately, a lot of ministers today are more pomp and circumstance as far as the church goes. They are worried more about the membership and how big it is and stuff. And my dad was worried about, more about the membership itself and not building, just building it in numbers only, caring about the people that couldn't eat the next day and, really caring about the community, caring about the next door neighbor.
South of Chicago in South Holland, you'll find a church headed by someone Vivian Moore, I'm sure, has no problem with. It's headed by her brother who carries her father's name, the Reverend W.J.G. Mclin, presiding elder of the Gary district of the CME Church and who carries many memories of their father.
I remember two images. First, his public image, which was one of many, many facets of ministry in the community, and as well as facets of ministry within the local church, which for a number of years was the St. Matthew Church, St. Matthew CME Church in Milwaukee. But in terms of his public ministry, he was always a person who was concerned about the little guy, the deprived, the people who were not as fortunate as others.
See, I know some of you all are short service oriented. And you want to be home in an hour. Well, that's not going to happen today. We're here to praise him this morning, amen?
Reverend W.J.G. Mclin carries his father's name and profession, but had to do much soul-searching about going into the ministry.
I had to do a lot of self-examination on that decision to answer the call to ministry. And I thought it was very important to determine whether my decision to respond to the call to ministry was just a mimicking of my father, or whether it was an answer to a sincere call, a genuine call, I should say, directly to me. After much prayer and meditation, I determined that although his influence was there, my calling was my calling individually. I remember him most as a father, a solid father who provided for us consistently, and he shared with us some experiences that were not regular experiences for African Americans in Milwaukee in the 40s and 50s.
We remember, and all of us talk about this, is every summer we had to go to State Fair Park. And our dad had this orange jungle hat that he wore and kind of stood out in front of everybody else. But it was a tradition, and it was something that we enjoyed doing. And he was a person that, in that day and age, we weren't always welcome everywhere, but he brought us up to feel like we were as good as anybody else. We could go anywhere we wanted to go, and we would quite often find ourselves the only people of color where we went, and So we grew up with that feeling of being sure of ourselves.
The issues in the African American community in the 40s and 50s were civil rights, equal opportunity, housing, and dealing with the problems of poverty. And the Reverend Mclin was attempting to address them all.
Civil rights, I know, was one of his strongest issues. Education was another issue that he was really strong on.
He always wanted to make a change. At one time, even though he's a minister, he went back to Marquette to take up law because he felt that as people of color, we were not being represented well. And he felt the ministry was good, but we needed help in that area. So he went back to school to become a lawyer. So when he decided to run for alderman, he wasn't satisfied with who was in the political arena at that time, and he felt that he would be of help. So he had a lot of people that backed him up, but there were many people that felt a minister should not mix politics and religion. And I think otherwise he would have won.
Reverend W.J.G. Mclin made 2 attempts for alderman in the 6th Ward, 1948 and 1952. He ran unsuccessfully but got the attention of the city of Milwaukee. Even in loss, he was able to collaborate with others to create significant change in the city. Former Mayor Zeidler remembers Reverend Mclin well.
I remember Reverend W.G.J. Mclin, particularly in the middle of the 1950s, 1955, 56. He was a prominent leader on the near north side of the city of Milwaukee at a time when there were some serious, very serious problems going with race relationships, with job opportunities, and with housing and shelter. And he was a kind of a champion of human rights in those days. He became prominent enough so that in the 1956 spring elections, I think, as I remember it now, he was a candidate for an alderman position. I don't remember, it was not the 6th Ward, but a ward created that was the southern boundary of which was Brown Street. After the 1950 elections, or after the 1950 census, the city government changed its ward boundaries. And there was, in 1952, a boundary 6th Ward, where there was a concentration of African-American people. In those days, it was black or colored. African-American is a relatively late name. The black population was concentrated south of Walnut Street and in that area.
At that time, St. Matthew's CME Church was located in the area of 5th and Walnut, 538 to be exact.
I think he was critical also of the fact that the white aldermen were not sensitive to what was going on with this new population that was coming in. At that time, there was an increase in the African-American population of Milwaukee at the rate of 5,000 new persons every year. So that there was a substantial problem of trying to find the housing and the shelter and other things. And this was a time when white realtors were panicking the white owners in the city by saying, we're going to move a black in your neighborhood and your property values are going to go down, so you better sell. That was a very common, that was what they call blockbusting. And those were all the issues that Pastor Mclin, Reverend Mr. Mclin, had to deal with in the time that he was running for alderman.
Reverend Mclin collaborated with many of the community leaders of his time, such as attorney Jim Dorsey, a very prominent attorney in the Milwaukee black community, Bill Kelly, head of the Milwaukee Urban League, community religious leaders, and was very much involved in politics, not only locally, but nationally. He was the only black or Negro at that time to speak at the memorial for President Franklin D. Roosevelt as the presiding elder for the St. Louis district of the Colored Episcopal Church.
It is entirely possible that if W.J.G. Mclin had been elected alderman, that there would have been a massive improvement in the housing stock in the area north of Brown Street in that district. What happened, however, ultimately was the housing stock simply collapsed. And that was the way the city dealt with the problem.
Former Mayor Zeiler said that the Reverend Mclin not becoming an alderman was a loss to the city of Milwaukee.
One of the things I remember very well is that his congregation, which was, of course, our congregation, the St. Matthew Church, was the first African-American church to be a part of television ministry on the network affiliate WTMJ, the NBC affiliate in Milwaukee, the first African-American congregation, and for a long period of time was a part of the regular church telecast. He was instrumental in moving the city of Milwaukee ahead in terms of public accommodations and access to some communities that the African Americans did not have access to, and so I would think that his contributions in Milwaukee paralleled what was happening in the nation, but the advances were accelerated because of his work in the ministry in Milwaukee.
There weren't a lot of people of color living in Milwaukee at the times that I can remember. This is early 50s, late 40s. And what he wanted to make sure, even at that time, even though there weren't people that were in unions, he made a strong effort to introduce them to a situation where they could get and maintain jobs.
Reverend Mclin was a man of high goals. He left his mark along the way: Detroit, Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Louis. Reverend or Dr. Mclin set the bar high. A 1924 Lane College graduate, 1937 Michigan State graduate with his master's degree, and his Ph.D. in 1942 from Lane also, and did attend Marquette University Law School. His children carry his legacy.
He pioneered with us as a father, and he was almost an extreme exemplar of correct use of the English language.
Dad was one person that made sure that you tried to your best to use the correct English. It was always yes, sir, and yes, ma'am. It was never first name basis. You had to get at least 12 years old before you could become familiar with someone. And even at that time, it was